Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. Now, I do hope that you are coming into this video after having watched the first video in our series on Shanda Sharer. But just in case you aren't, I'm going to link that first video in the description box down below, and I highly encourage you to go back and watch that video before you watch this one. The first video, we went over the people involved in this story and kind of gave a little bit on their background and the motivation that actually led to the murder that we are going to be discussing today in this video. So it's good to have the before we get into the actual murder. Now, if you have watched the first video and you're ready to jump into this one, let's go over a real brief summary of the video from last time, just so we have a little bit of a refresher before we get into anything new. Our victim is 12-year-old Shanda Sharer. Now, Shanda had gone to a new school, and had started dating a young girl named Amanda Heavrin. Amanda Heavrin was Melinda Lovelace's ex-girlfriend. Melinda Lovelace would recruit one of her best friends, Lori Tackett, who in turn would recruit two of her friends, Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, to kidnap, torture, and murder Shanda Sharer. That's basically what we went over last time. And I told you a little bit about these four women and their background. Not women, four children, because the oldest was 17. The two youngest girls were only 15, and Shanda was only 12. So this horrible story that we're about to go into today involves children. And 33 years old, even the 17-year-old, to me, is a child. And this case absolutely blows my mind that children did what they did. So with that being said, before we get into the actual details of that night, here is that final trigger warning that I gave you on the last video. We are going to be going into some pretty deep details. Those details include torture, some sexual abuse, as well as obviously murder. And it's pretty horrible. So if that's not something you can handle, then this is not the video for you. But I think to truly be able to answer the question of was justice served, which will basically be what the last video is going to be about, it's hard to hear these things, but I think knowing the full story is going to be important to answer those questions. So like I said, it's going to be rough. I have cried a lot anytime I talk about this case, and I'm going to try to get through this case without crying. My husband thinks I'm going to be strong, and so I'm going to try to be strong. If I'm not strong, I'll try to edit it out. Okay? Okay, so let's get into where we left off with the last video. In the last video, we had talked about how Lori Tackett picked up Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence from their homes in Madison, Indiana. And the three girls drove from Madison, Indiana to Melinda Lovelace's house in New Albany, Indiana. And on the way there, the plan was to go to a concert in Louisville, Kentucky. According to Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey, that's what they thought the game plan was. And it was part of the game plan. The girls definitely planned on going to a concert in Louisville, Kentucky that night. Once they got to Melinda's house, like I said in the last video, it was the first time Hope and Tony had met Melinda. They went up to her room. They started trading out clothes and getting ready for the concert. And it was then that Melinda first presented the idea of scaring Shanda Sharer that night. And she had pulled out a kitchen knife and said that she was going to use it to intimidate Shanda with. As the evening progressed, scaring Shanda had transformed into killing Shanda. to the point where they had started to make plans that when they went to Shanda's house to get Shanda, they couldn't send Melinda Lovelace to the door because Shanda and Melinda had been getting into fights enough at school that, remember, her mom had Shanda taken out of that school and put into a private school. So there's no way Shanda would go with Melinda if she went up to the door. So they had planned for Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence to go to the door because Shanda didn't know who they were and they'd be more likely to be able to get her to come with them. When Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey knocked on Steve Sharer's door that night, it was actually Shanda who came to the door. But since Hope or Tony didn't know Shanda and had never seen the girl before, they obviously didn't recognize her as the one who answered the door. And so they asked to speak with Shanda. Shanda introduced herself and basically said, "Yeah, that's me." At which point, Hope and Tony had told her that they had been sent to get her by her girlfriend Amanda to take her to an abandoned building, like fortress area that was known by locals as the Witch's Castle. And there, Amanda would be waiting for her because she had something very important to tell Shanda. Now, Shanda's dad, Steve, was in the background and he was a little bit suspicious. He was kind of eavesdropping because these girls didn't even seem to know Shanda and he picked up on that. So Shanda stepped outside and spoke with the girls and said, "I can't go right now, but if you come back later after my dad's asleep, then yeah, I'll go with you then. Just come back sometime after midnight. But this time, make sure you have Amanda with you." And Shanda went back inside. When she went back inside, she explained to her dad that it was some kids from school and they wanted her to go to the mall and she sent them on their way. When Tony and Hope got back to the car without Shanda, Lori and Melinda were kind of disappointed and they were a little bit upset. But Hope and Tony assured them, "Hey, it's not a big deal. We'll go to the concert." And Shanda said, "We can come back later. We'll just come back later. We'll go to the concert right now. We'll do our thing in Louisville and then we'll just come back." And that's what they did. They went to the punk rock show that they had originally planned on going to in Louisville, Kentucky. And when they were there, surprisingly, Tony Lawrence had actually told two boys that her and Hope were hanging out with that Lori and Melinda had planned on killing a girl that night. And either the two boys didn't take it seriously or what, but it was never reported. So the night continued. By the time they left the concert in Louisville and made it back to New Albany, Tony Lawrence really didn't want to participate at this point. And so she refused to go to the Sharer family door. And so this time it would be Hope Rippey and Lori Tackett who would go to Shanda's front door to retrieve Shanda. And before they headed to the front door, Lori would hand the knife to Melinda. Melinda would lay down in the back seat, like on the floorboard, and Lori would cover her with a blanket and kind of like with fast food stuff, kind of to camouflage her body. So Shanda wouldn't know right away when she got in the car that Melinda was there. When the girls made it back to the car, Shanda would end up being sat between Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey, and they would go on their way to the Witch's Castle. Like I said, the Witch's Castle was an abandoned, rundown building, and that's where they told her Amanda would be waiting for her. During the drive, they actually started talking about Amanda, and when it was brought up, Shanda had said the two girls had been dating for about 4 months. So as soon as Shanda had talked about how long her and Amanda had been together, that is when Melinda Lovelace would sit up from the back seat. And when she'd sit up, she'd grab Shanda by the hair and she'd put that knife to her throat. And she would immediately start interrogating Shanda about the relationship that she had with Amanda. How long had they been together? Did they have a sexual relationship? Were they writing notes to each other? At which point, Shanda started to beg Melinda to not hurt her. She started to beg Melinda to let her go. She said she'd do anything. She'd stop talking to Amanda. She'd stop writing notes. She'd completely cut her out of her life. She just begged Melinda to stop. But Melinda didn't stop. The entire drive to the witch's castle, Melinda had her hand in her hair and that knife on her throat, just constantly asking her about her relationship with Amanda. Now, when they made it to the witch's castle, the girls would get Shanda out of the car and they'd take her inside where they would take all her jewelry, her watch, her rings, any of her necklaces. They would take stuff off of this poor 12-year-old girl. They would tie her hands together at the wrists. They'd tie her feet together at the ankles. They would retrieve a t-shirt from the car where they would soak it with whiskey and they'd catch it on fire. And probably the most chilling part about this moment, especially if you know how our story ends, is Lori Tackett would look at Shanda and she'd point to the t-shirt burning on the ground and she said, by the end of the night, that's going to be you. Now, they actually were not at the witch's castle for very long because cars were driving by and the headlights kind of got them a little nervous that they were going to get caught. So the girls ended up loading her back into the car right in the middle between the girls yet again, and they would leave the witch's castle. And they had to stop and get gas. And so when they got to the gas station before they pulled in, they would cover Shanda with the blanket that Melinda had used to hide earlier in the night. And Lori and Melinda would stay in the car to make sure Shanda stayed put and didn't scream. And Hope and Tony would get gas. And once they got gas, they would go inside the gas station and they flirted with boys inside the gas station. And they paid for their gas and they made phone calls to people, but they never made anybody aware of what was going on in the car or what was about to go on in the car with Shanda. They just treated it like it was a normal night. Now, although they would end up getting turned around, they would eventually get back on the road and they would head to Madison, Indiana, which, like I said, is my hometown. They would end up going off some country roads to an empty clearing, and that clearing gave them the privacy that they were looking for. Once they made it to this clearing, Tony Lawrence would tell Melinda that she should take Shanda home, and Melinda wouldn't. And so Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey would stay in the car, but Melinda Lovelace and Lori Tackett would get out of the car, and they would drag Shanda out of the car. And they would order Shanda to strip, which she did. And this is southern Indiana, and it's January. It is freezing cold outside. But she took everything off except for her underwear. And Melinda gathered the clothes, ran back to the car, and threw them in the car, saying that she was going to keep them for souvenirs. Now, she did have the courtesy to grab a t-shirt of Hope's to take back to Shanda for Shanda to wear. And for some reason, Hope put on Shanda's bra while they were waiting in the car. And when Melinda got back to Shanda, Lori Tackett held Shanda's arms behind her back so that Melinda could punch Shanda once really hard in the stomach. And she did. And Shanda, again, begged for Melinda to stop. She told Melinda that she would cut contact with Amanda. She begged for Melinda to have some mercy. She told Melinda she had asthma. She told Melinda she couldn't breathe. And Melinda responded by grabbing the 12-year-old's head and repeatedly slamming her face into her knee until her face was broken and bloody. Now, at this point, Shanda's laying on the floor. And Melinda decides that she is going to take that opportunity to kill Shanda. And she takes the knife and tries to slit Shanda's throat. And it doesn't work. She even puts her weight on the knife, attempting to stand up on the knife to cut Shanda's throat. But the knife is too dull and it doesn't cut Shanda's throat. So then she tries to strangle Shanda. And at one point, they get rope. And Melinda and Lori work together to strangle Shanda until she passes out and is unconscious. At which point they pick up the 12-year-old girl and they throw her in the trunk of the car. When they get back in the car, Hope, who is 15 years old and behind the steering wheel, asks if they killed her, if she's dead. And they said, yeah, we killed her. And so Hope is freaked out and she takes the car and she speeds off. And in the process of the car speeding off, they actually tear the muffler off the car. But Shanda was not dead, at least not yet. At this point, the girls would end up going back to Lori Tackett's home in Madison, Indiana, and they would go up to her bedroom to kind of just process the night, and they would hear Shanda's muffled screams coming from the trunk. Lori would stand up and she'd say, I'll take care of this, and she went to the kitchen and she got a knife. And she made sure to come back in the bedroom before she went outside, showing them that she had found a knife. And she went outside with the knife, and Shanda's screams did stop, and Lori Tackett came in covered in blood. And it was about 2:30 in the morning at this point. And Lori would go and she'd get herself cleaned up, and she would suggest that the four of them go out driving so they could get rid of Shanda. And Hope and Tony Lawrence did not want to go and do this. They didn't really want to be a part of this right now. And so Lori Tackett and Melinda Lovelace would go out on their own back in the car with Shanda in the trunk. Now, before they headed out, before they actually left in the car, Lori would notice that her neighbor's lights were on. Now, this neighbor, for whatever reason, had a working vending machine on their front porch. And so Lori decided to go to their home to see if she could get change for $1 for the vending machine, to see if the neighbors seemed to be suspicious of anything going on. Remember, Shanda was just now screaming from the back of the trunk. Lori wanted to pretty much make sure that they didn't see or hear anything that Lori didn't want them to see or hear. And the neighbors didn't make it seem like they had seen or heard anything, but they did ask Lori what was wrong because she seemed off. And Lori had told her that she had torn the muffler off the bottom of her car and she was kind of stressed about that. And they offered to take a look at it, and Lori, turned them down. So when Lori got back from the neighbor's house and got in the car with Melinda, she had told Melinda that maybe the plan should just be to drive around for a while and let Shanda die slowly. Because remember, Lori had gone out and stabbed her who knows how many times while the girls were up in her bedroom. They would begin driving towards Canaan, which is another small town that's right next door to Madison. And not long after, Shanda would start screaming and kicking again. Now, as Shanda was screaming in the trunk of the car, Lori would pull the car off the side of the road and she would grab a tire iron, and she would take that tire iron to the back of the car, open the trunk, and use it to hit Shanda over the head with. And when she got back to the driver's seat, she had bragged to Melinda Lovelace about caving the young girl's head in. They would start to drive around talking about catching Shanda on fire, burning her. And so they pulled over and they went to open the trunk to kind of formulate a plan. And when they did, to their surprise, Shanda, whose eyes were rolled in the back of her head, who was absolutely drenched in blood, sat bolt upright and said, "Mommy." And they slammed the trunk on top of her and they got back in the car. and they started driving again. And this time they decided, instead of catching her on fire, maybe they would just throw her over a bridge. And so they drove to one and they parked the car, and they had planned on throwing her over the bridge. But for the second time that night, they had gotten spooked by some headlights, and they worried that they were going to get caught. And so they shut the car door again, got back in the car, and drove off, leaving a knife behind. As they drove around trying to think of what they should do, Shanda would periodically make gurgling sounds from the back of the trunk, and she would kick. And every time she made noise, they would pull over and they would take turns taking the tire iron to the trunk and hitting Shanda over the head with it. Melinda Lovelace would say later on that they hit her no less than 60 times in the head with the tire iron. One of the last times they opened the trunk, Shanda was still able to speak, and she said Melinda's name. And they shut the trunk on the girl. And then they went back to Lori's home with Shanda still in the trunk. And they had bragged to the other girls what they had spent the night doing. It's morning by this point, and the girls would end up telling Lori's mom that they were going to go to McDonald's for breakfast. And so they ended up leaving the home. And before they went to McDonald's for breakfast, they went to a clearing where there was a burn pile, and they had talked about burning Shanda there, but they weren't sure if they were going to be able to because it's January and the pile had frosted over overnight. But while they were there, Melinda and Lori asked Tony and Hope if they wanted to see the body they had in the trunk. And Tony didn't want to see, but Hope said that she would like to see. And they opened the trunk. And when they did, rather than being repulsed by what I'm sure is an awful sight, Hope picked up a bottle of Windex and sprayed it on Shanda's open wounds. Now, Shanda's still alive at this point. Believe it or not, Shanda's still alive. And Hope spraying her down with Windex in her wounds and poking fun at her, teasing her at this point, saying, I bet you don't feel so hot right now, do ya? And you might think Tony sounds like she's innocent, and maybe she didn't do as much as the others, but she's in the car revving the engine right now just in case Shanda starts to scream. She is being the cover. She never once told anybody what was going on, despite the fact that she went into a gas station and made phone calls and talked to people inside. The girls do decide that they are going to catch Shanda on fire and they're going to burn her alive, but they're not going to do it here and they're not going to do it in this spot. So they go to another gas station because they need more gas from driving around all night with Shanda in the trunk of the car. They get more gas. They purchase a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, which they empty and they fill that with gas. And they get back in the car to finish out their night, their morning, this nightmare. They would end up taking Shanda along the Jefferson Proving Ground, and they would go to a off-the-road country road called Lemon Road. And this is a very, I don't want to say secluded area, but it's country roads. I mean, it's not like you have neighbors upon neighbors upon neighbors. They pulled off into a cornfield. And when they opened the trunk to get her out of the trunk, she was still clinging to the blanket that they had in the trunk with her. By this point, she wasn't talking, but she's still very much alive. They would put her on the ground, and after some back and forth between Lori and Hope, Hope would end up pouring gasoline from the bottle of the 2 liter of Pepsi, and they would catch her on fire. And they would get back in the car and they would start to drive away. And Melinda would tell them to stop because the fire had already started to die down. Melinda would get out of the car with the Pepsi bottle and she would go back to Shanda's body and she would dump the rest of the gasoline on top of her and light her on fire again. And when she got back to the car, she was laughing about how funny Shanda looked with her tongue going in and out of her mouth due to being caught on fire alive and being burned to death alive. And then after that, they went to McDonald's for breakfast. After that, they went to McDonald's for breakfast, like they told Lori's mom they were going to do. Toni Lawrence would be the first of the 4 girls to break the silence and tell an outsider about that night. And she would actually do it at this McDonald's. And she would do it when they were waiting on their food. She would call her friend Michael, who was supposed to be her alibi in case Toni's mom called to see where she was. And so she had called Michael to see if Toni's mom had called her to check in. And when she was on the phone with Michael, Michael knew that something was wrong with Toni. Something was up. And Toni told her that something bad had happened, that the girls that she was with that night had killed another girl. But before giving too much details to Michael, Toni would end up hanging up the phone because she was afraid that the other girls would overhear her. After breakfast, Melinda and Lori would drop off Toni and Hope back to their homes, and they would end up going back to Lori's house where Lori's dad would fix the muffler. They would clean out the inside of the car, like fast food wrappers and trash, and they would take the car around back where the water hose was, and they would spray out the trunk, and then they would go back to New Albany, to Melinda's house. When Lori and Melinda made it back to New Albany and made it back to Melinda's house, Melinda would actually be the second of the 4 girls to break the silence and tell an outsider about what had happened over that night. And she would call another one of her best friends, Crystal Wathen, and invite her over to her house to tell her about the whole ordeal. And while she waited on Crystal to come over, she would call Amanda's home. But Amanda's dad said that Amanda was at the mall. And so Melinda would call River Falls Mall and she would have Amanda paged over the system. And when Amanda would come to the phone, Melinda would tell Amanda that Shanda was dead and that they would meet up later on that day to talk about it. In the meantime, Crystal did end up showing up, and almost right out the gate, Melinda and Lori started telling Crystal all about what they had spent the night doing. And Crystal didn't really seem to believe them all that much. And so Lori pulled out a knife and told Crystal, "This is what I used to stab her with." The girls would end up getting back in Lori's car together and they would drive to River Falls Mall where they would meet with Amanda and immediately again launch into the exact same story that they had just told Crystal, only this time they were telling it to Amanda. And as a final sign of proof that the story they were telling was real, they would pop the trunk of the car. And despite the fact that the trunk had been rinsed out with a garden hose earlier that day, you could still see bloody handprints all on the inside of the car. Back in Canaan, where the foursome had left Shanda's body to burn, Dawn and Ralph Foley were out getting ready to hunt quail. And while they were out, they saw the burning pile on the side of the road. And when they got closer to it, originally they thought maybe it might be a mannequin, maybe it might be trash. But when they got up on it, they knew almost right away it was a horrifically burned body. Now, the top half of Shanda's torso was almost completely blackened. Her lower half wasn't as badly burned, but it was a bloody mess. The only clothing that was shown on this little girl, because she had been caught on fire, anything that she would have been wearing would have been gone, except she was wearing her blue panties, which were pulled off to the side. Now, this is in 1992, so it's not like everybody has a cell phone in their pocket. So the brothers actually had to go back to their home in order to call the police to tell them about what they found. And when they had called, they were told to go back to the spot to meet law enforcement at the spot. And so that's what they did. They went back to where Shanda's body was, and they would wait for police. Back in Jeffersonville, Indiana, Steve Sharer was worried about his daughter. He had woken up around 7 in the morning and could not find Shanda anywhere. And originally he thought that maybe he might have locked her out that night because he woke up around 4 o'clock in the morning to go get a drink, probably use the bathroom. And when he did, he noticed that the kitchen door, like the door to outside, was cracked. And so he assumed that somebody had went to shut it behind them and it just didn't catch. So he pulled the door shut and made sure it was locked. And his first thought was she had snuck out and now she's locked out of the house. And so he would look for her and he would call her friends. And the more friends that he would call, the more worried he got because nobody had seen or heard from Shanda all night. And so finally, around 1 o'clock, he let his ex-wife, Jacqueline, know that he could not find Shanda, and the two of them would end up making a police report. Back in Canaan, the sheriff, Buck Shipley, would end up calling for backup from the state police because this is a small town and they did not have the means to even begin to tackle this kind of situation. And Detective Steve Henry would be one of the police officers to respond, and Curtis Wells would also respond, and he was a forensic investigator. And immediately, Curtis thought that the body had looked like it had been posed, and it had looked like it had been sexually assaulted. He said this, one, because of the panties being pulled to the side. He also said that it looked like there were signs of sodomy, which unfortunately did end up being confirmed from the autopsy. There was internal bleeding on Shanda from inside her rectum several inches deep. And the bleeding would suggest that it happened while she was alive. We don't know who did that. But it was definitely done to this 12-year-old girl. The men would spend their morning cataloging evidence and taking pictures of the crime scene and bouncing theories off of each other. Now, their first impression was they assumed that this was a young woman of maybe her late teens to early 20s. They certainly did not think that it was a young girl who was about 12 years old. I don't know if it's just because they didn't want to think that, because as morbid as it is, I have seen autopsy pictures from this case. It's right there in one of the books that I have read on it. And her narrow frame and her thin torso and thin chest, it just looks like a child to me. So I don't know if they just didn't want to see it, but for whatever reason, they did not think it was a child. They thought it was a woman in her 20s or early teens. They also did not think that it was someone local because the brutality of this crime did not seem to go with what they knew went with small town life in the early 1990s. So they had assumed that it was a drug deal that had come from one of the bigger cities, maybe Indianapolis, and that is what had happened to this woman. Something with drugs from the big city. It couldn't possibly be what it was. It couldn't possibly be a young child killed by other children in the small town of Madison, Indiana, or Canaan, Indiana. And since they thought that it was a young girl in her 20s or her late teens, and since they weren't looking for super local, when they searched for missing persons, they didn't find any missing persons because Shanda wasn't missing from Madison or Canaan. Shanda wasn't missing from Indianapolis or one of the bigger cities. She was missing from the small town of New Albany or the small town of Jeffersonville. But she also wasn't in her late teens or her early 20s. She was 12 years old. And so they came up short when they searched the missing persons. They still did not know who this was. Now, the first lead in the case would not come in until 8:20 that night. And that night, Sean Piles would end up going to the police station to make a report about something that he had overheard at the bowling alley. He had seen a group of girls there talking about how they had just witnessed a murder. Now, while the police are taking Sean's statement, a phone call comes in from the sheriff's office, and the sheriff has with them none other than Toni Lawrence. Toni Lawrence had gone in with her parents to the sheriff's department to tell them everything that she knew. Or so she said. Her story wasn't 100% accurate, but she had told the sheriff that she and Hope Rippey had gone with Lori Tackett to New Albany to Melinda Lovelace's house. And she told the story about how Melinda wanted to kill a girl named Shanda, who Toni thought was around 13 years old, because Shanda had stolen Melinda's girlfriend. Now, while Toni is telling this story, police are contacting New Albany police to see if there is a missing persons report filed for a Shanda who's around 13 years old. And there wasn't. But as Toni's story progressed, police found out that despite the fact that Melinda lived in New Albany, and despite the fact that New Albany is primarily where Shanda lived, Shanda was staying with her dad that weekend, who lived in Jeffersonville. So police called the Jeffersonville Police Department to see if a police report had been made for a missing 13-year-old girl named Shanda from there. And it hadn't. But when they called the sheriff's department for Jeffersonville, a police report had been made there by Steve Sharer and his ex-wife, Jackie. And it was for their 12-year-old daughter, Shanda Renee Sharer. Okay, guys, that is where we are going to end today's story. This one was very heavy. It was a lot to get through, and our next and final chapter is going to go over the arrests, the trial, the sentencing, releases after the sentencing, and kind of my thoughts and wrapping it up. I appreciate you sticking with me so far. This is the hardest one to get through. The next one's going to be hard as well, but it won't be as hard as this one. I had to pause a couple times telling this one because to me, this is one of the saddest stories I've ever heard. But thank you again for sticking with me. Once I update it with Chapter 3, the third series, I will also update the description down below with the third installment. If you want to be notified as soon as that third installment comes out, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Make sure your post notification bells are turned on. Until next time, though, friends, like I always say, take care, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later. All right? All right. Bye.